All right, chapter 12, we're going to focus on patterns of inheritance. This is sometimes kind of referred to as more classical or Mendel type genetics. So a little bit of background. Gregor Mendel, sometimes referred to as the father of genetics because of some of his early contributions, kind of like Darwin's referred to as the father of evolution. And it is interesting that these two were contemporaries, but they didn't really know each other, yet both of them had some very significant contributions to our understanding of not only inheritance, but of course, natural selection, evolution, and speciation. So Mendel was born and raised on a farm in the Czech Republic, and in the 1840s, he entered a monastic lifestyle and studied science. And it is kind of interesting that at this time, a lot of scientists were monks. So in 1857, Mendel began to work to perform experiments with garden peas to gain an understanding of inheritance. He was, like Darwin, very observant, and he kept good records of things, which at this time, in the 1800s, was probably very, very challenging, since most of the record-keeping tools were simply pen and paper. Now, he chose peas because as he noticed these patterns, he could also strictly control the breeding of peas. Random breeding would make understanding inheritance patterns very difficult. And so he could control the breeding to prevent this random breeding. And to do this, he allowed no self-pollination, as the male portions of the flowers were removed prior to maturity. So Mendel actually played the role of the bee here to perform the cross-pollination of individual plants. Now, after the peas were pollinated, they of course were allowed to complete their life cycle, and the peas were removed from the pea pods, and Mendel could track the offspring from individual parents. Now, there were lots of different varieties of peas, and Mendel kept records of things that he called characters. Like flower color is a character. And Mendel understood that these were heritable features. These characters, like flower color, could be seen being passed from generation to the next. Now, he called traits these variants for a character. So if flower color is a character, then having purple flowers or white flowers are the traits. And Mendel began his projects with pea varieties that he considered true breeding. And what this means is that when he self-pollinated these individuals, they only produced offspring that are the same variety. So a true breeding purple flowered plant only produced offspring with purple flowers if it was self-pollinated. And the same holds for the white flowered pea plant. It would only produce flowers with offspring with white flowers if it were self-pollinated. Now, in a typical breeding experiment, Mendel would cross-pollinate two contrasting true breeding pea varieties, and he called these hybrids. So, crossing the two true breeding parents were known as the pea generation. The hybrid offspring represent what's called the first filial generation, or the F1 generation. And Mendel carried out most of his experiments at least to the second filial, or the F2 generation. Now, he produced the F2 generation by allowing the F1 generation to self-pollinate. So here's a diagram kind of showing what we just discussed. Here's our true breeding parents, a pea plant with purple flowers and a pea plant with white flowers. And yet when these two were crossed, the F1 generation hybrids all had purple flowers. And then as he allowed the F1 generation to self-pollinate, he saw in the F2 generation that there were usually 75% purple and 25% white, or a ratio of 3 to 1. As a reminder, you're going to need to be able to do some simple fractions, ratio, percentage conversions to answer some of these questions. Now, from these really simple experiments, Mendel derived two laws: the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment. And we're going to take a look at each one of these separately, but it is interesting that you got to keep in mind that all of this occurred well before we had the technology to understand how meiosis worked. Like in your case, you know more about meiosis than Mendel did. And some say that Mendel got lucky, and we'll talk a little bit about how that probably did happen just because of some of the characters that he tracked. And some say that Mendel cheated and fudged the data. Who knows?